In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how authentication, logging in, credentials, and authorization, securing specific resources to specific users, work in ASP.NET Core. Now, this is something kind of cool because if you go out there and you're looking for videos, you're going to find a lot of people who use third-party frameworks. Like they might be using ASP.NET Identity, they might be using an OAuth provider. In this video, I'm going to start with the empty template, and we're going to roll our own authentication. Now, to be clear, rolling your own authentication is not something you should do in a real app. You should use somebody's frameworks. But the problem is when people use these frameworks, they often don't gain a good understanding of what's happening under the covers and where those connection points are for the various frameworks. So by doing this video in this way, I'm going to show you how this stuff all comes together so that when you go to use an OAuth framework or you go to use ASP.NET Identity, you'll be able to better understand what's happening. Now, as far as what I'm going to show you today, the first thing is how to differentiate between an anonymous user and an authenticated user by examining the user property, which is available in your controllers and views. I'm also going to show you how to store an authenticated user's security context in a cookie. We'll also restrict access to certain controller actions based on whether a user is authenticated or whether they are anonymous. We'll configure the cookie's properties, and we'll also allow an authenticated user to log out, which will invalidate their cookie. Now, what I'm not going to do is make it pretty. So I'm not going to mess around with CSS or anything like that. And I'm also not going to add any unnecessary features at all. This video is going to keep it really concise and focused on only authentication and authorization because everything else is a distraction. So the first thing we're going to do is create our new project. We're going to use the empty template because it won't have anything installed by default. So let's go ahead. We can select that if it's in your recent projects. If you can't find it, just search for empty. It will show up in the list. We want the ASP.NET Core version. Now, next I have to give it a project name. I can call it whatever I want. We're going to call it Skill Foundry Auth Basics. That's a good enough name. I'm going to put the project and the solution in the same directory because we're not going to be adding any class libraries or any other features. Now, .NET 9 is out. I'm going to use .NET 8 because it has the long-term support because that means this is going to work for the next 3 years. So we'll say create, and we'll wait for it to create the project. It's going to spin everything up, and we're going to end up with a basic empty template. There will be nothing turned on by default. Now, if we go into our Program.cs file, we're going to see literally we don't have controllers enabled. All we can do is the shorthand map get, which we will be taking out because we're going to use controllers for this application. So let's go ahead and get this all set up. Now, there's some boilerplate code that we need to add. Now, if we want to use controllers and views, we're going to ask the builder to add this to the services. We have a add controllers with views method. Now down here, after we build the app, now we're going to start turning on some features. We're going to tell it to use HTTPS rerouting so that if somebody tries to access our app using a non-secure port, it's going to force it to go to the SSL port, which is something you should do in all of your modern applications because there's no reason not to use SSL. We're also going to turn on routing so that we can get to different routes using our links. And we're also going to tell it to use authentication. Now, this is what's going to turn on the ability to have users log in and log out. And combined with that, once they're logged in and logged out, we also want to secure resources based on who they are. So we're going to tell it to use authorization as well. So always remember as a beginner that authentication, the act of logging in and logging out, and authorization, what you can do, are two different things. And last thing, we're going to add the default controller route. So this is pretty standard. It's in most of the templates. We're going to give it a name. We're going to call it default. And then we're going to specify what we want our route paths to look like. Now mine is going to be a little different than the one that comes in the templates because the one in the templates includes an ID parameter. This demo is not hooking up to a database or anything like that, so we don't need it. So I'm going to say controller equals home. So that'll be the default slash, and then the next thing will be the action, and the default will be the index. And then normally there would be another slash here, and you'd put the ID, but like I said, we're not working with a database, so that is completely unnecessary. And this will give us what we need to get started building controllers. Now, the next thing we want to do, because I'm going to use some hyperlinks and I want to have the ASP.NET tag helpers available, is we're going to add tag helpers to the project. Now, again, this is something that comes in the basic templates, but when you choose empty, you don't get it. So I'm going to add a new folder. I'm going to call it views because that's the convention. And inside views, I'm going to add a new item. Now, ViewImports, if you're not familiar with ASP.NET Core, is a file that lets us specify certain things we want to import into our views. So it's almost like it's called ViewImports, right? Now, this is where you're going to add your tag helpers. And Microsoft has a whole bunch of these built in that will help you. But if you want to get some third-party ones, this is where you're going to add them. I'm going to go ahead and just add all of them for convenience here. And we're going to get them from Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC.TagHelpers. And just by adding this to this file, we'll be able to use these in our views now. At this point, we're at a good place to test because we've configured some things, we've added some things, we're doing it by hand because it's the empty template. So let's go ahead and add our home controller. So I'm going to add a new folder. I'm going to call it controllers because that's the convention. And then I'm going to add a controller. It'll be an empty controller. Home controller is a good name. And we've got an index view. Now let's right click this. Let's add a view. It'll be an empty view. The name of it will be index. It should put this down in a subfolder in views. It did. And let's just put an H1 tag here. And we'll just say, hello world, just for now. And if I run this application, this view should render. Now, if this is your first time doing it, since you've updated or installed Visual Studio, it may ask you if you want to trust the ASP.NET Core Developer SSL certificate. You should almost always say yes. Yes, I'm going to edit the certificate authority. And we can see now it rendered. We got our index view. The controllers are working. Everything looks good. So we're ready to move on. Next, let's go ahead and set up a dummy repository that's going to contain our user information. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm going to show you how to hook in to authentication and authorization in ASP.NET Core. And for convenience, we're going to just hard code a couple of accounts. So let's go ahead and right click and add another folder called models. And let's go ahead and add a class that's going to handle our user authentication. And we're going to call this the user manager. And the first thing we're going to need is a data model for a user account. So down here, I'm going to say public class, user account. We're going to keep this very simple. I'm going to give it a couple properties. One is going to be the username. One is going to be the password. And the last one is going to be a list of claims. Now, what's a claim? A claim is a key value pair that contains data about a specific user. Now, in security world, these claims can contain information like whether or not a user is an administrator. It can contain other information like their email or their date of birth or anything else that we might want to use as part of authorization, which is what they can do in the app. Now, there is a claim type that is built in. So when I say claim, you can see here system.security.claims. So that's going to be added as a using statement. Other than that, it's just a standard list, and we can use this collection just like we would any other. Now, as far as our user manager is concerned, we're going to need a couple things. Now, I'm going to make it static because this is a demo app. So by making it static, it'll spin up, it'll automatically load all its data, and we can just use it. In a real-world scenario, you would be getting your users either from an OAuth service, you might be getting it from a database. There's a whole bunch of different ways. But what I want you to think about as a beginner is that this is really kind of a black box. ASP.NET does not care where you're getting your user data from. We can authenticate from anything. OAuth, identity server, identity framework, doesn't matter. So this is just going to simulate that piece. So we're going to say public static list. Let's get a list of user accounts. We'll just call this accounts. And then we'll create a static constructor so that it populates the data automatically. So in the constructor, we will say our accounts equals a new collection here. And we'll add 2 new accounts. So the first account will be our administrator account. The username will be admin. The password will be something easy for us to remember for this demo, which will be testing123. And then the claims. Now in the claims, there's a couple different things we want to add. So the first thing is instantiate our list. And now we're going to add a claim. And you'll notice when we say new claim, there's a couple different overloads. Now the most common one is going to be the key value pair. So you can just give it strings if you have something custom, but there are also claim types that we can use. So let's go ahead and say claim types dot. And all of these types are things that are recognized by the general developer community. So later on, if you decide to do JWT tokens or something and you want to put claims in there, there are some claims that are predefined by this schema. So when those are available, I recommend you use them. Now, one of the most important ones is name, because if we have a claim type of name, then ASP.NET will pick that up. And when the user logs in, anywhere that we ask for the identity's username, it's going to use this value. So this one's very important. You want to put this on all of them. And we're just going to call this admin. Now, the next claim we're going to do is going to mark them as an admin. Now, this is one of the custom claims. Again, key value pair. I can name this claim whatever I want. Admin is a good claim for determining whether someone is an admin. Naming things is normally hard, but this one, not so much. And then you can give it a value. Now, if it is a Boolean value, we're only checking for the presence of it. So this value could technically be whatever we want, but I'm going to give it a string of true just so it's obvious to other developers that this is a flag claim. So there's one user account. Now let's go ahead and copy paste this to save us some time. And the second user account, let's use our friend John Doe or Jane Doe. It's Jay. You can make up whatever name you want. This account is not an admin, so we're going to take out the admin claim, but they do have a name, and we want to make sure that gets picked up. So this is good. Now we have 2 different user accounts. One is an administrator. The other one is not. The last thing to round out this class is some way to authenticate the user. So we're going to receive a username and a password, and we're going to use the username and password to grab the user account if it matches. This is where in a real application, you would obviously be calling out to an identity server or an OAuth store or something like that. But for demonstration purposes, we're just going to do it here locally. So I'm going to say public static. We're going to return the user account if they can successfully log in. They're going to give us a username and a password. And then since we have a local collection here, we're just going to use some link real quick to hook this up. So find me the first or default account that the username matches the username that they're giving us, and the password is the same as the password that they gave us. So this will return an account if it matches. If it doesn't match anything, it's going to return a null. And now that we have all this in place, we're ready to start having some fun. So let's go over to our index view, and let's go ahead and start changing this out. So we're going to call this cookie authentication in ASP.NET Core MVC. Now let's start working with the user property. So this property is available in all controllers and in all views. So we'll say currently the user is, and then we're going to put in our @ sign with a parenthesis so we can write a C# expression. Now the user property, like I said, is available in all controllers and all views. And when we put the dot, the next one we want to look at is identity. And you can see that identity is nullable. So if we have not logged in a user, if we have not assigned an identity, this will be null. So when we're using it, we need to be careful that we don't get null reference exceptions. So I'm going to use the null operators to handle this situation. So I'm going to say user.identity $.name $anonymous. Now, if you're early on in your C# journey and you're not super comfortable with these operators, what we're saying here is in the user object, check the identity.name property. However, if identity is null, then instead give me the string anonymous instead of trying to get to their name, which would cause an exception. And if you're having trouble with these C# basics, I recommend, hey, Skill Foundry, I have C# courses that take you from 0 to hero. So if this kind of stuff is difficult for you, maybe you need a little more practice, check out the courses. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to say if user.identity, and again, identity can be null, so we're going to use the null checking. And it has a property called isAuthenticated. This is true if the user's logged in. It's false if they're not. So again, we're going to say if there is an identity and it's authenticated, we're going to print this stuff out in our HTML. And if it's not, then we're going to give it the value false. That way the if condition will be satisfied. And then we'll have an else block. Now, what are we going to put in here? If they're authenticated, I just want to print out a message. I'm going to say they are authenticated. And in the else, I'm going to print they are not strongly authenticated. Just like that. And the last thing I want to do is I want to list out all of the claims that are associated with that user. Now, again, we're going to say if, we're going to go to the user, and there is a claims property at the top. And what you'll notice is that this one is not nullable. So we don't have to use null checking for claims. So I'm going to say if user.claims.any, so if there are any claims, then we'll go ahead and print these out in a list. So we'll create an unordered list. We'll say for each claim in user claims. And then for each claim, we will put that in a list item. We'll say claim.toString. If there aren't any claims, then we'll just say no claims found. Now let's go ahead and run the application, because now when we get to the index page, it's going to start checking the user, its identity, whether there's any claims. And because we haven't logged in, we are going to be what's called an anonymous user, because by default, everything in your web application is accessible to everybody, whether or not they are logged in. So we're going to see what that looks like here when we run it. And as we can see, currently the user is anonymous. This is what we expect. We haven't logged in. We're not authenticated. And we have no claims because we are anonymous. And now we're ready to start working with the authentication and authorization features of ASP.NET Core. Previously in our Program.cs, we turned the features on, but we didn't really do anything with them. So the first thing we're going to do, whenever we want to use cookies, we should give those cookies a name. And that name is really important because everywhere in our code, logging in, logging out, in our Program.cs where we configure things, we need to use the same cookie name. So there's two ways you can go about this. You can put this in a configuration file, which I'm not going to do because that's extra, or you can just create a constant. I'm going to create the constant so that we can move on with our lives. So in the root of my project, I'm going to add a new class, and I'm just going to call it settings. And this class is going to have one property, public constant string auth cookie name. And we will just call this skill Foundry cookie demo. And this is a name we're going to use everywhere. Now, we want to get this set up so that our application starts using this auth cookie. We're going to do that in program because it's part of the builder services. And to understand why we're doing this, in ASP.NET Core, your client sends a request. And when that request is received by the server, it's going to go through something called the pipeline. Now, the pipeline is just a bunch of code that acts kind of like an assembly line. So the request is going to come in, and there's something that's going to grab it and say, hey, what route are you looking for? And it's going to handle all that. And it might do things like logging, and it might do stuff like exception handling. And then eventually it's going to get to the controller, and it's going to run the code in the controller and your view that we wrote. But kind of sandwiched between that, we can have different types of middleware that we can add to the pipeline. And authentication is one of those middleware services, and it's going to run authentication and authorization before it gets to our controller code, because you shouldn't be running controller code for things that you're not allowed to do. So we're going to add this to the services. We're going to say builder.services add authentication. And it's going to say, okay, what kind of authentication would you like? Well, we're going to use cookie. There's a couple different types. There's bearer token, there's OAuth. So this system is really flexible and we can plug in a lot of stuff to it. But we're going to start with cookies. And then the next thing is, what do you want your cookie to be named? Well, we did that with our settings class. So I'm going to say settings dot, we're going to have to add our using statement. And it is the auth cookie name. And then the next part is configuring the options for this cookie. Now, there's a lot of different options. I'm not going to cover all of them in the video. I'm going to cover the basic ones we need to get started. But if you're looking to customize how your cookies are handled, going to this options is the way to do it. Now we're going to use our arrow function because we're going to be configuring this using the kind of fluent stuff. And it's not parentheses. I always do that wrong. It's curly braces. So excuse me while I clean this up. Even after 30 years of coding, I do not type perfect code all the time, as you can see. Okay, so this is what it's supposed to look like. Options, arrow, curly braces, ending parenthesis, which means this parenthesis is in the wrong spot. And now we're happy all the red went away. So one of the things we can set an option for, and when you look at the dot, you can see there's a lot of different options for handling these things. But one of the ones we're going to want to look at is the login path. So what does this do? If a client attempts to access a secure resource and they haven't logged in, this is where it's going to send them. So this is going to be a controller and action. It's going to be your login form. So I'm just going to call this auth/login. Now the next option is going to be the access denied path. So what's the difference between login path and access denied? I said the login path is for people who aren't logged in. But there could also be people like J. Doe who is not an administrator. He's logged in, but he's not an administrator. If J. Doe tries to go to something that is admin only, it is going to redirect them to this path. Now, usually what you call this is forbidden. So we're going to say auth forbidden. So if a registered user tries to get to something they're not allowed to get to, it's going to send them there. Then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to set the cookie name to our settings cookie name. The rest of the code we don't need to touch. So now that we've done that, we also want to configure our claims. So we do have a claim for whether or not somebody is an administrator. Because where we're at right now is we can only tell if somebody is authenticated or not. If we want to get more granular, this is where the claims come in. So I'm going to say builder.services.add authorization. Because remember, authentication, logging in, authorization, what can you do with your claims? So same thing here. We're going to add some options using the arrow function. I'm going to type it correctly this time, I hope. That's much better. And for each policy you want to configure. So what's the difference between a policy and a claim? A policy can be a collection of claims. Oftentimes a policy is only associated with one claim, but it can be associated with multiple claims. And we can write logic. Like if you had a claim that had the person's date of birth, you could add a policy that was adult only, where you could limit resources to only people whose date of birth said that they were above 18. Those are all things you can do. So this is really granular and really cool. So we're going to say add policy, give the policy a name. Well, this is the admin policy. And then you set the options. So I'm going to say, in this policy, you are going to require a specific claim. And you see here, you can require a whole bunch of stuff. But we're going to require a specific claim. So it's going to loop through the claims list associated with that user. And I'm looking for a claim named admin, which has a value of true. Just like that. And now we have an administrator-only policy that we'll be able to use later. And now we've kind of got the underpinnings set up in our configuration. Let's go ahead and let them log in. So we want login and logout functionality. We're going to add a controller that's going to allow us to do this. So let's go ahead and right-click our controllers folder. We're going to add a new controller. And this is important. These paths, auth, I'm going to name this the auth controller so that these paths actually work. So pay attention to your naming conventions or you're going to run into a world of hurt. So we're going to call this the auth controller. And in here, we're going to have two actions. We're going to have a login, that's the get that gives us the form. And we're going to have the post that receives the data for the form. And that's all we're going to focus on right now. So we're going to have a login, and then we're going to have a post. And this one is also going to be called login. But this one is going to receive a view model. And later on, we're going to come back and we're going to make this async because the sign in is async. But for now, I just want the placeholders. So we're going to create a model called a login form model. And we'll create that right now. So we'll save this, go over to models. We're going to add a class. This is going to represent the data coming from our login form. And this is only going to have two fields. We're going to call it username. And we're going to call the second one password. Just like that. Now back in our auth controller, we're going to have to add the using statement so we can get to it. Everything's happy. Let's go ahead and create our view. So we're going to right click here. We're going to add a view. It's going to be an empty view. We're going to call it login so it matches the view name. And then we're going to tell it that we're going to give it this model. So we're going to call it skill Foundry auth basics dot models dot login form model so we can bring the data down to the form. Then we'll just say login. Again, this is going to be pretty ugly because we're not doing any CSS because that's just distracting and it takes extra time. So we're going to create a form. Its action is going to go to the login action on the auth controller. The method is going to be post. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to put a div. We're going to put a label, ASP4, the username. The label text will be username. And then we're going to put in our input, ASP4, also the username. That'll be good. And then we're going to do the same thing for the password field. Don't know why that's highlighting. There we go. Turn that off. And this one is going to be the password. The label should say password. Now, normally I would change this type to be password so it hides it from people typing it in, but I want to be able to see the password so that I know during this demo that I'm not typoing the password and wasting everybody's time. So I'm going to leave that as text intentionally. Then we're going to have a button. The type is going to be a submit button for the form, and the button will just say login. So this is the simplest, dirtiest, ugliest login form that's ever been created on YouTube. Now we can go back to our auth controller and we can do this post method. Now, like I said, the signing in that's built into ASP.NET Core uses an async method. So we want to make this controller action async. And again, this video is not about asynchronous programming. If you want to learn a little bit more about async in ASP.NET Core, check out the Skill Foundry courses. But we're going to have a task iActionResult. We're going to receive the login form model, and then we're going to get the account. So we'll save our account, and we're going to take this login form model. We're going to pass it over to our user manager that we created before. We're going to call this login method and see if we can get an account back. And again, this is where in a real application, this is where you would call out to an OAuth server like Google or, ASP.NET Identity or something. Everything I'm showing you here is the core of what ASP.NET gives you. And it's your job right here to plug in your authentication system. So I'm going to say user manager.login We're going to pass it the model username and the model password. And if it finds a match, it's going to give us an account back. Now, we set it up so that the account would be null if it fails. So I'm going to check, is the account null? If it's not, we can log them in. If it is, this is normally where we would send them back to the form and we would give them a nice error message, but we're trying to save some time here. So I'm just going to return the current form with the current model. If I log in and I stay on the page, it didn't work. If they do log in correctly, then I'm going to redirect to the home index because that's where we put our user information code. And that's what's going to show us that we were able to log in. Now, this is where the magic happens. We're going to log in. So if we found the account, I'm going to create an identity. Now, remember back on our index view, we were checking an identity. So this is what's going to set that up. So I'm going to say var identity is equal to a new claims identity. And I'm going to give it the current account claims. And then I'm going to associate it. See how it says authentication type? I'm going to associate it with my auth cookie by name. And this is where I was talking about how important it is to keep that name handy and use the same name every time. Because if you don't have the same name in your Program.cs as you do here, it's not going to work. So we have an identity. We're also going to create a principal. And this will be a new claims principal. And we're going to give it the identity. Now, the next obvious question is, Eric, what is the difference between an identity and a principal? And the easiest way for me to explain this is that in real life, you have many identities. You might have a driver's license and a school ID and a government-issued passport, and you might have a badge at work. Those are all identities. The principal is you. So this is really powerful. It actually supports attaching multiple identities to a single principal user. So just know that when you get deep into security, you do have a way to have multiple identities and use those identities under a single principal. It's really nice when you need it. Now we're going to log in. Logging in is async, so we're going to await it. And we're going to use the HTTP context. Now, this is an object that is available in all controllers. And this context object is kind of the God object when you're working in a controller or with ASP.NET Core, because this is going to have all the stuff in it. Like if you want to see the original request that came from the client, it's in the context. So this is an object that if you're new to ASP.NET, I recommend you read up on it. I recommend you explore it on your own because this is where some really powerful stuff can be tapped into. And one of the methods we've got on here is SignInAsync. And you can see that that's coming from Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication. If we didn't, in our program, if we didn't add authentication and authorization, you would not be able to use this. So that's kind of what turns this on. So I'm going to say SignInAsync. Now, I'm going to use cookie authentication. So again, I'm going to use this cookie name. And what would you like to put in the cookie? Well, I would like to put the principal because that's where all of our user information and our claims and everything we need is in that principal. So this is what's going to go in the cookie and what's going to control our ability to log in, log out, and access resources. So now let's see if I did all this right. So we're going to hit play and we're going to run the application. Now, what should happen is we're going to start as anonymous, and we see that. Now I'm going to manually go to my login page, which is auth/login. And here we go. We got our ugly form without CSS. And we're going to type admin hello, 1Password. I would like you not to be here. And then we're going to use our password, which is testing123. Now, if I log in correctly, it's going to create that cookie and it's going to send me back to the home index page. So when I hit login, there we go. It changed. Currently, the user is admin. They are authenticated. And here are my claims. And because I use the claim types.name, it actually gives the schema that everybody else uses. This is for compatibility. I know it's kind of ugly. It's a web address, but because we set that claim type's name, this admin will be the username. So that also means that you can use a name that isn't the same as the login name if you want to. And then because I logged in as the admin user, we see admin is true. Now I'm going to hit F12. I'm going to open the Google Chrome Developer Tools. And one of the things we're going to find here is that there is, in the application, cookies. So I open this. Here's a cookie associated with my web application. And there is our cookie right there. And there is the cookie data. It has been encrypted. Now, by default, ASP.NET is going to encrypt it using the data protection API. Now, what does that mean? It means that there's a certificate on my computer that it is using to encrypt this cookie. Now, why do I care? Well, because I didn't specify any particular certificate, which is fine if you're running on a single server. But if you're ever building an application where there is load balancing, where you have multiple servers that need to be able to read these cookies, then you need to install a certificate on each of those servers. It needs to be the same one. It needs to be named the same. And then all of those servers will be able to work. So that's just a caveat here. I know you're beginners and you're only going to be working on a single server, pretty much all the time while you're learning, but just put something in the back of your head that encryption requires a certificate. And if multiple servers need to decrypt, they all need access to that certificate. And you can use something like an Azure Key Store or AWS or just the file system. There's a lot of different ways to handle security certificates. Just be aware of that. So there's our cookie. Everything's good to go. Let's move on to the next step. We can close this out. That's going to stop our application. And now let's create a route in a controller that should only be accessed by authenticated users, which means you have to log in to get to this page. So we're going to go back to the home controller and we're going to add a new action result. And we're going to call this one users only. So only if you're an authenticated user will you be able to get to this view. And I'm going to go ahead and right click this. We're going to add the view. We're going to name it users only. And we will give it some basic HTML, users only, with a little description. We'll say, this route is only available to authenticated users. Now let's go back to our index page and let's add a link to that page. So we'll say ASP-action equals the name of the route, users only, and the controller will be the home controller. And we'll call this the users only page, just like that. Now, if I want to secure this in my controller, I can use an attribute. So attributes go above your controller method names. These attributes can also be put up on the controller class. So I can also put it up here, and I'll explain the difference in just a moment. But you're going to be shocked at how easy this is. The attribute is named Authorize. And as soon as I put this on this route, only authenticated users can get to it. If you put it up here on the class, then every method will require you to log in. Well, I want the index method to stay unauthorized, so I'm going to put this down here. Now, as soon as I do that, I'm going to save it. I'm going to run my application again. And I'm going to start as logged out. Currently, the user is anonymous. Now, what we did back in Program.cs, remember we set up a login path that was going to be triggered. And we said go to the auth login page if somebody is not authenticated and they try to get something. This is where that kicks in. When I click this link, it says it tries to authorize me and it says, you can't go here. You're not authorized. You're anonymous. So why don't you log in? And I say, okay, I can log in. So I'll go to JDoe, just like that. We log in. Current user is JDoe. Now I can click the users only page and I'm allowed to access it. So now we not only have authentication where we can log in, we also have authorization where we have limited it to only logged in users. So the next step is how do we limit something only to administrators? And this is where our policy comes in. We added a policy called admin that requires the admin claim with this value. So let's go ahead and wire this up. We're going to go to our home controller and we're going to add an action for admin only. We're going to return a view. Now, in a real application, we would probably create controllers that had admin only stuff in it, and we would put the authorize attribute at the top on the class so that they would all be secured. So I'm going to say authorize. And then all you do is you put a parenthesis and you give it the name of the policy that it requires. Done. Now this action is associated with the admin policy. So let's go ahead and right-click this, add a view. It'll be called admin only. And this one is going to be administrators only. This page is only accessible to users with the admin claim. Now let's go to the index page and let's add a link to our administrators only page. And now let's run our app. Now we see both links. If I try to go to either of them, I'm not logged in, so it's going to ask me to log in. Let's try JDoe. If JDoe goes to the users only page, everything is fine. If we go to the admin page, we get a 404 because we haven't actually created our forbidden view, but you can see here it tried to go to auth/forbidden. So let's go ahead and set that up really quick. Let's go over to our auth controller and we'll add a new action result called forbidden. And this is what will be displayed to users who are signed in, but not allowed to do what they're trying to do. So we'll add the view. We'll give it the same name as the action. And in this one, we'll say H1 forbidden. You are not allowed in here, you naughty person. Just like that. Now let's try this again. Try to go to the admin only page, JDoe, testing 1, 2, 3. Try to go to admin only. You're not allowed in here. You're a naughty person. If we do it again, but this time we log in as the administrator, things will work just fine. So admin, testing 1, 2, 3. Go to the admin only page. And we were allowed in. So now we see how we were able to authenticate and then authorize based on being logged in and based on a particular claim policy. But let's keep going. Now, one thing I didn't add when I created the cookie was the ability to persist it. You'll notice when I start and stop the application, it logs me out. I become anonymous again. And that is the default behavior for these cookies. It will not remember your login unless you tell it to. So let's go ahead and fix that. It's very handy when you're first getting started building like I was, because every time I rerun the app, I don't want to have to log out. I just want to relog back in while I'm testing things. But now that we're pretty far along, let's change that. So over here in the auth controller where we log in, we use the SignInAsync method. Well, there is an overload of this method that we can use to control some of our cookie settings. Now I'm going to call this props because it is an authentication properties object. And again, this object has a lot of different features that we can turn on. One of them is persistent equals true. Now I'm hard coding it to true. Another thing you could do is, when you go and log in on certain sites, there's that little checkbox that says, remember me. If somebody checks that box and it's in your model, you could set is persistent based on that. I'm going to hard code it to true because I want to log out explicitly. One of the other options is, how long do you want this cookie to live? How long do you want them to stay logged in without having to relog in? And this is expires UTC. So it uses universal time, because using local time when you're running a server that's accessed by people around the world is kind of stupid. So you're going to store all of your base stuff as UTC. And all you got to do is give it a date time offset versus the UTC now. So that's going to give me the current date and time in UTC format. And then you can just add hours, days, minutes, months, whatever you want to give them. I'm just going to say add hours 8. So for this user, if they log in the morning for their shift at work, it's not going to prompt them to log in for the rest of the day. So add hours 8, and then all we got to do is pass those properties to our sign-in method. So now let's go ahead and run this. We're going to start out anonymous because this wasn't turned on before. And let's go ahead and go to our login page. I'll log in as admin. And now you see we're logged in. I'm going to stop the application. I'm going to run it again. And I'll still be logged in as admin now because I told it to persist the cookie for 8 hours. So there's a lot of different features and things you can do to adjust these things depending on, how you want to manage your users and their login sessions. Now, the last thing I want to do is log out. So here in the auth controller, let's add a post action. And we'll say public async, because just like logging in is async, logging out is async. So this is going to be an async task. iAction result. Let's go ahead and scroll this down so it's in the middle of my screen. And we're going to call this logout. Now, logging out is pretty easy. All we need to do is await, and we're going to go to the context. And we're just going to call sign out async, and we're going to give it the cookie name because everything is attached to this cookie. So when we call sign out async, we give it the cookie name. It's going to tell the browser to invalidate that cookie, and everything will be great. We'll return to being an anonymous user. And let's just go ahead and redirect to the index page of our home controller when that happens, so that we'll be able to see the message update that we are no longer logged in. We're going to need a button and a form because this is a post. So let's go ahead and edit our home index page to show this button and form if we are authenticated. So right here, they are authenticated. Let's go ahead and add a form. We're going to point it at that auth controller. We're going to point it at the logout action. And it's going to be a post. And all we need in here is a button. that is a submit button. Having trouble typing. There we go. Just like that. Now, I'm going to save this. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And we are still logged in as admin. And now this shows up when we are logged in. If I hit the button, it's going to call the sign out async. That returns us back to anonymous user. The button disappears. Everything is good. And just to tie this together for you as a user, this part right here, if they're authenticated, showing them that they are authenticated and having the button, if you're building an app and at the top of the app you have that nav bar that you see on most applications where if they're not logged in, there will be a login button. And then if they are logged in, it shows them the username and gives them a logout button. This is exactly how they do that. You're just writing if statements with custom HTML, altering your navigation bar to have login or logout depending on whether or not the user is authenticated. So this really isn't that hard once you understand how things work. And that's all there is to this video. The main thing I want you to take away with you is that what we set up in our Program.cs, where we added cookie authentication, where we added authorization, depending on what types of authentication and authorization you are using, this is the hook. This is where things plug in. So if you're going to use cookies, if you're going to use JWT tokens, if you want to use OAuth, all of it starts here with adding authentication and authorization, and then calling the HTTP context sign in and sign out async methods, which were over in our auth controller. So as long as you understand in theory how identities, claims, principles, how all of these things come together, you'll be able to figure out and use any third-party provider, or, if you're feeling brave like I did here, you could roll your own. Happy coding.